Hello and welcome to Atheists Talk. My name is James Zimmerman. I'm going to be your host for this episode. And today we are going to be discussing humanism. We'll call this episode Humanism 101. And I have with me Audrey Kingstrom. Welcome, Audrey.
Thank you.
Audrey is the president of the Humanists of Minnesota, located here in the Twin Cities. And for a quick background on why she's here with us today, let's ask Audrey about herself.
Okay. Well, I went to seminary when I was young, intending to be a Lutheran minister, and I'm a native Minnesotan. And I started after college, a few years after college, I started at Luther Seminary here in St. Paul. And that just wasn't working for me. I was really questioning my faith a lot. And so a pastor, mentor friend of mine suggested I go out to New York City to Union Theological Seminary on the Upper West Side. It was a non-denominational seminary. And so I headed out to New York and went there and tried a lot of different theologies out, a lot of feminist theology and liberation theology, but I just couldn't make any of it work for me. So that even though I did finish the degree, I came out an atheist. So then after that I had to go, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? So I was able to get a job actually in publishing on the Upper West Side, right around where I had been at the seminary, and did educational publishing and worked on a degree in education and went into teaching then for a few years. By that time I was married, taught for a few years in New York City, and convinced my husband to move to Minnesota.
Is he a native New Yorker?
New Jersey.
New Jersey, okay.
Yes,
yeah, East Coast, yeah.
Yes, East Coast. His family, his father lived and worked in New York City, or around the city, worked in the city.
So you've been back in Minnesota for 20 years,
yes,
about, and here you became acquainted with the First Unitarian Society and the Humanists of Minnesota. Mm-hmm. And then you're even a humanist celebrant now.
Yes, I decided finally after I had gotten involved at First Unitarian Society, which is a humanist congregation, and I was doing so much programming and stuff for them, and I'm going like, you know, I was going to be a minister. I can do this as a humanist, especially now in the last several years, both in the atheist community and the humanist community nationally. They've been encouraging people to become celebrants. Okay. So I decided to do that a few years ago, and I got more involved with the Humanists of Minnesota, and a couple months ago was elected the new president.
Oh, okay. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Brand new president. So when we were designing this show, emailing each other back and forth, you said there's three major tenets, overarching tenets of humanism that you felt kind of covered all the bases. Why don't we go over those one at a time? The first one was naturalism. Yes.
Naturalism is really the foundation of how we know what we know. And fancy word for that is epistemology. How do we know what we know? And so humanists are naturalists. And we know the world through science, through evidence, through our reason, through empiricism. I like to use the word naturalism instead of going through the list of science and evidence and being able to, through our senses and all different ways of explaining that. Philosophical naturalism and scientific naturalism is, just think of it as opposite of supernaturalism. We are not supernaturalists, we're naturalists. So that's our way of knowing.
All right, and then next was ethics.
Yes, humanism is a worldview or a life stance that makes ethical commitments to the world. I would say two things, all of humanity as well as the planet. So we care about the well-being and the flourishing of all. Human flourishing is sort of central to that ethic, and our ethics are based on human need and experience as opposed to some revelation from God or some sacred texts or anything like that. It's based on naturalistic ethics. And therefore, we also care very much about the planet as well. And we see ourselves as part of, the biosphere, the environment, and we care for this world, the only world we know for sure. And it's our home. And so we take responsibility for that as well.
Okay. And then the third tenet you said is meaning.
Yeah, and the reason I like to talk about that is there are these lots of things that if you look at the Humanist Manifesto, and it's been rewritten like 3 different times over the course of the last century, but it just sort of sums up that we make our own meaning. Unlike religious people who think their belief system, their supernatural belief system gives them their meaning. No, each of us are responsible for creating our own meaning in life and finding our sense of purpose and creating positive life experience for ourselves and for others on the planet. And so we're creating that meaning. And so that's sort of an important aspect as people consider humanism as a life stance.
Okay. So it sounds like there's a lot of overlap between humanism and atheism, even sounds like it in your own life. So would you agree with that?
Oh, very much so.
What are some of the differences, though, then that distinguish those two terms? Or
well,
and what are some of the similarities?
Yeah, well, I would say that, James, I assume, identify as a humanist also,
Yeah,
in addition to being an atheist, but you're more active in the Minnesota Atheists. So you might answer that question better than I, but most of the atheists that I know through the Minnesota Atheists also identify with humanism and humanist values. I think it's more a difference of sort of how you publicly want to identify yourself. I consider myself an atheist as well, although I haven't always used that term. In the last 10 years or so, I've wanted to use it more just because in our society that's so religious, I want to kind of help get rid of that stigma about being an atheist. But I more want to use the definition, or use the identity as humanist because I want to speak about what I do believe in. And I think that is what the humanist identity offers. And I know other people who also feel that way, who may be atheists, some may be agnostics. So humanism maybe has a little bigger tent than atheist. But I don't know, maybe you could say something more about why you use atheism maybe as, maybe you don't use it as your major identity, but
yeah,
certainly.
No, not major. I think it depends on how people, or what question people are asking. You know, it's like if people say, do you like to play sports? And I say, no, I have kids. I mean, that answer doesn't really make sense because those are 2 different areas of my life. If they said, do you like to play sports? And I say, no, I like to collect stamps. That would be more logical because I'm saying, no,
Right.
instead of doing this hobby, I do this one, you know.
Right.
And I don't collect stamps. I just pulled that out of thin air. But, so if people are saying, do you believe in God, which is a question that's been asked a lot, especially because I left a very conservative faith, so family members and friends, ex-friends have asked that, and then I just say, no, I don't believe in God, I'm an atheist, you know.
Right.
They don't really ask what I believe now, because a lot of them just frankly don't care. They're, you know, just not going to be in my life no matter what. But so it depends on what they're asking, you know, and on a form I filled out once at a hospital of all places, it said, religion, and left a blank, and I just put none because to me that's the appropriate answer. I wouldn't put atheism because that's not my religion. I wouldn't put humanism because that's not my religion. So I think I keep saying this. It depends on how the question's being asked. Like if someone's saying like, how do you view the world? I would say it's more a humanist outlook. But if someone says, what's your specific belief about supernatural deities or about, you know, the God that the monotheists are always talking about? I gave a presentation once at Hamlin where I talked about my former religion and coming out of that, and then in the question and answer discussion, the students were asking about what I believe now. And so I talked about both atheism and humanism. And I said, I actually prefer the term humanism, but you guys have never heard of it. And I just kind of threw that out there. And I said, well, here, let's just do a survey. And I asked who had heard of atheism. Everybody in the audience raised their hand. There were Muslims there. There were people who I think probably had a similar worldview to me. They all raised their hand, right? And then I asked who had heard of humanism. I thought I would have seen some hands, but not a single person raised their hand. I think the professor probably had heard of it and just was opting out of the hand-raising thing, but not a single student raised their hand.
Right.
I mean, these were not kids. These were people between, 18 and 40, I mean, these were college students. So I thought that was kind of odd to see no hands. But it made my point. I said, see, this is why I don't want to say humanism, because then you're all going to scratch your head and say, what? You know, I said, now don't get me wrong, with atheism, people have bad assumptions like that you're against God or you're being dogmatic or something. But at least you've heard the term and you have some idea where I'm coming from. Whereas with humanism, you might just be like, what? So I don't know if that's a good reason to not use the term. Maybe that's a reason to use the term, is to bring it more out there. But when you're just trying to give a quick elevator speech to people, it's nice to be able to quickly say what you believe or how you view the world.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting sort of dilemma, is that people don't know what humanism is. So one is one of the things I hope to do as president, and certainly of the local humanist group, but nationally also, I know we want to get the word out about humanism as a life stance. But there's also some problem with that, because some people think then that they're trying to either, if you do that too much, they're trying to identify it as a religion. And I, for one, don't want to identify it as a religion. Although historically, when we're talking about historical events, the last 100 years I would still say is rather modern or contemporary. So humanism kind of as a contemporary movement came onto its own, you know, really in a bigger way about 100 years ago. And it really came out of, you know, an evolution of religion. And so the first religious humanists, they called themselves religious humanists, and they had the, you know, kind of form of community and church-like structures, but it was religion without God. And so they saw it as an evolution of religion. And I think, well, I don't know for sure, I'm thinking, given this was the early 20th century, they had a very progressive era. You know, religion was losing its hold. The world was becoming more secular. I think they just thought this would be a natural evolution, and this is our life stance, a naturalist worldview, and also a naturalist ethics. It didn't happen, but that's how you got ethical culture. You had ministers who were leaving their traditional Christian churches, becoming naturalists and identifying with humanism, and some of them started the Humanist Society. Some joined Unitarian, became part of the Unitarian Church or Association, and some, like the First Unitarian Society, which I have been attending for the last 16 years. That's why they call themselves societies.
Yeah,
you know.
Instead of church.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's kind of stuff was happening around the country. And that religious humanism was religion without God. Today, when people think of religious humanism, they think of humanism where people still have some kind of God belief. And I'm not sure why that has happened, but one reason is by the mid-century, you had people that wanted to say, no, we don't want to call ourselves religious humanists. We want to be secular. We don't want to be associated with the term religion at all. And so that's when the American Humanist Association and other of the Council for Secular Humanism, some of these organizations became more prominent. So today we still have the issue of, you know, whether you consider yourself a religious humanist, or whether you consider yourself a secular humanist, or whether society looks at humanism as religion. And I myself don't want us to go down that road, and that's why I want to not claim religious humanism, even though I understand its history, is because in our society that is still so religious, that really, I think, muddies the water.
I think so too, yeah.
And, you know, clearly I want to say humanists are naturalists, and that's the way we approach the world.
Yeah. It really depends on an agreed upon definition of religion, which is probably difficult.
Yes.
Like with any large terms like that.
Yeah, because I mean, if you look at sociology and anthropology, and you know, is Buddhism a religion? Was Confucianism a religion? That's how some of the early thinkers and philosophers in the 20th, Western philosophers in the 20th century were sort of seeing it. It's like, oh, humanism, it can be like Confucianism.
Yeah.
Or
So that brings up another good point, though, is that besides Buddhism, let's say that you're a Christian or a Muslim, can you also say that you're a humanist, that you ascribe to all of the tenets that we talked about earlier?
Well, I'm sort of figuring out as I work more in the humanist movement that some people do. I mean, I can't be the humanist police and say,
right.
no, you shouldn't call yourself
it's really
a humanist.
A matter of self-identification.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And so when people come to one of the events of our organization, and I have, do programming around trying to educate people about what humanism is, I try to really emphasize those three things: is that we make our own meaning. Mm-hmm. We are naturalists. We're not looking to supernaturalism or superstition in any way, and then there's an ethical stance. So people can get. So a lot of people do live their lives that way, even that claim to be religious.
Sure. Yeah.
Let's face it, our modern world with modern medicine, modern technology, everything that we know, has come through science, science-based world. That's largely what we live in. And somehow people kind of can set aside part of their life for some kind of, other belief system. So
that's for our next show on cognitive dissonance.
Yes, exactly. That's why I feel it is. It's real to me, and I couldn't live with that cognitive dissonance. In fact, I went to seminary with some of these people, very liberal. And so part of it becomes how you want to define God.
Yeah. That was my next question, actually, is let's say that you're not religious, you don't belong to any church, you say, I used to be Catholic or whatever, and now I'm not, but maybe you still believe in some sort of supernatural power. Could you then be also a humanist?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's more the kind of person that I will run into that will still use a humanist. And it's not far from how perhaps our founding fathers or philosophers and scientists, educated people thought during the Enlightenment. During the Enlightenment.
Yeah, this makes me think of deism.
Yes, exactly. Let's face it, we can't prove that there's not a God. Mm-hmm. Those of us who identify as atheists just think that there's not enough evidence to convince us that there's not a God. But, so I like to think of it as like, I've come to think of it more as God is irrelevant in the equation of my life. I mean, I'm still comfortable now, or I should say not still comfortable, I'm more comfortable, partly because of where culture has gone, and I want to make that distinction that I'm an atheist. But actually, it's like God is irrelevant. Because if there was, this God is not, if there was such a force in the world, this force has not been very clear about how that affects how this force should affect our lives and how we should live. So I think the God question is irrelevant. If people want to believe that there's some force out there, people talk about its ground of being, ultimate meaning, all kinds of what I would call very liberal definitions of religion and God. And if they want to do that, as long as you aren't going to bring that to the table if you're hanging out with other humanists and atheists, fine. You're living your life as a naturalist. You're living through naturalistic ethics, and you're not getting your meaning from some outside source.
So it almost sounds like if someone says, I'm a humanist and I believe in God, like your curiosity would be such that you'd have to say, how are you defining God, or what do you mean by God? Not to start an argument, but just out of curiosity as to what's going on. Yeah, that's interesting. So let's set aside religion and think politics now. If you are a humanist, a lot of the things you talked about sound more like on the liberal spectrum of things. I don't mean liberal in the traditional sense. I mean liberal as in like Democratic Party.
Yes, or probably a term that's used more today is progressive
yeah.
politics.
So do you think that one goes hand in hand with the other?
Well, the short answer is no. It's not a foregone conclusion. I could get in big trouble by what I say now. So
sure,
I'll be diplomatic. But I do think that people that have identified and been recognized as humanists have been known to be more liberal and progressive. And I think the reason for that is that humanism really requires a naturalistic approach to life. So we're based on the social, not only hard sciences, but the social sciences. And now what we're also learning about the brain, what we learn about how society functions. And so I would say that humanists tend to be a lot more pragmatic. So we are trying to figure out how do we flourish as a human species, and how do we help sustain the planet. And so I know some people think that liberals are connected to an ideology, and when they are knee-jerk liberals or knee-jerk progressives or knee-jerk Democrats that are just saying something because that's what they've always said, then that should be questioned. But certain things within conservatism is sort of stopping knowledge in a certain point of time, or a way of thinking about the world, or drawing on an ideology like free market capitalism. Like that's an ideology, that's like, this is how the world works. No, that's an ideology. It gives us some understanding of how the world can work and how it has worked, but then you're looking at, well, what are the consequences of that? And then the humanist ethic takes hold and said, you know what, that's led to some bad things. Is there a better way? We always are open. The humanist is always open to looking at the consequences of our political policies and always evolving to work towards human flourishing for all.
That sounded diplomatic.
Well, I hope so, but...
Yeah, a development in the past, I don't know, half century or since World War II maybe, has been that social causes have become pigeonholed with certain political parties. So it almost seems like you're going to identify more with certain parties, even if you're not a card-carrying member of such and such party. Just if you have a certain worldview or a certain belief on even just one social issue, that's almost going to force you to vote or identify more with a certain party. So I would imagine that humanists are not immune to that.
Right, and I just think that obviously the Humanists of Minnesota is a nonpartisan organization, and is going to remain so. But and of course, both the national organization and local organizations tend to be very careful about how they weigh in on issues. But again, I would argue that humanism is an ethical stance. We are making ethical commitments when we claim ourselves to be humanists. And I do think we have to weigh in on the issues, not in a partisan way. Right. And maybe we're not all going to agree on them, but that we engage in the debate. Otherwise, we leave it, I think, to the realm of corporations to be setting the ethics in our society, or other religious groups. And so that's why I think it's imperative, and I've seen the same thing happen even in the atheist movement. You could probably speak more to it, but I have heard some prominent atheists speak to we have to weigh in on some of these issues as well. And I certainly think that humanists need to do the same, even if they're tough conversations to have.
So we've talked a little bit about humanist strands throughout, well, not throughout, but in the last couple centuries of history. But how about throughout the cultures that we see in the world today? Is it predominantly a United States thing, predominantly Western, or do we see some in other parts of the world?
Most people think that humanism comes out of, or the strands come out a lot of ancient Greece, the classics, and then Western Europe, Age of Enlightenment, the Renaissance, all of that. And a lot of it does come out of there. But I certainly am one humanist thinker who sees humanist strands throughout the world. And not to say that no historians or philosophers will give some credit, but so much of the way contemporary humanism is viewed really comes out of that Western world. Sure. However, certainly within Eastern thought, there are a lot of humanist ideas in terms of this sense that we're all one, you know, and that
respect for life.
Yeah, yeah, and respect for the natural world, and actually sort of pantheistic thought too, in like Africa or South America, or even some native religion. And even though there may be superstition involved in those, these are evolved. Again, religion and belief systems are constantly evolving, just as they have done here in the West. And so those strands of sort of a more unified understanding of the world that comes certainly out of the East and out of pantheistic thinking, I think really supports a humanistic worldview. But of course, you have to take out like the superstition and stuff like that. But there are pieces of it.
All right. Well, we only have a couple minutes left, but I want to give our viewers, our listeners, just some places to go if they want to learn more, like websites or books. Maybe you can talk to them real quick.
Sure. Just for the websites, of course, you can go to the Humanists of Minnesota website, humanistsofmn.org. There's the American Humanist Association, which is the national organization.
Okay.
And then there's the Council for Secular Humanism. And all of those organizations, you can find out what's going on locally with our organization, but there's lots of information about humanism and issues that they're taking on by going to their websites. A couple of good books, I think, if people want to do some reading, is Good Without God by Greg Epstein.
Okay.
Secondly, Living Without Religion, which is by Paul Kurtz. Paul Kurtz died just a few years ago, or well, actually, I think a couple years ago. And his book, Living Without Religion, I think is just superb in terms of thinking of humanism being an alternate worldview, not a religious worldview, but an alternate worldview from religion. And that's very good. And then there's a book called Humanism, a beginner's guide that they put out in England
by
Peter Cave.
Okay. All right. Well, sorry to cut you off. We're all out of time, but I thank you for joining us because it was very educational, and I hope that everyone learned more about what humanism is, and hopefully to get the word out there a little more. And thank you for listening to our show today. Again, my name is James Zimmerman, and if you are interested in Minnesota Atheists, please contact us on the information you see on the screen. We'll be happy to send you a copy of our newsletter so you can learn more, because if you're interested in us, we're interested in you. Thank you.